بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وحده وصلواته وسلامه على رسوله المصطفى وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. So I thought I would take a few moments to expound upon my comment in social media yesterday in response to Reza Aslan's comment that he made, in which he said, quote, "No hadith is historical by any modern standard of history. They were all created to justify orthodox behavior at time," meaning at that time. So I made a bold statement in which I said this statement of his is a statement of kufr, or a statement of disbelief. And for clarification, most people understood, but some people didn't, that I was not calling Reza Aslan a kafir. But I did and still do believe that his comment was a comment of kufr. And beyond that, because some people, the vast majority, agreed, and it was interesting. I actually received a number of phone calls from other scholars, other imams, in which actually all of them, without having to name names, were in concurrence with the observation, and that essentially we were on the same page. My statement of it being a statement of kufr was essentially in congruence with many leaders within the community. But aside from that, my concern with Reza is with obviously the position of privilege that he holds, in which he has the ability to speak to a very large audience. He has the ability to speak on behalf of Muslims, whether or not they would like him to do so. And he does speak with a level of authority. And at the same time, the bulk of what he says is in contradiction to what the vast majority of Muslims believe. And he himself is completely detached, really, from the broader Muslim community. This is a problem of not just Reza Aslan. Many other Western Muslim academics are completely detached from the realities and communities in which Muslims actually live in. But given that he also has a bit of celebrity, and this isn't hating on him for that, but it's just the power of amplification that comes along with that. And because in some of these, I guess you could say, controversial debates or whatnot that he had with people like Bill Maher or Sam Harris, some Muslims who apparently felt threatened by atheism found value in his rebuttal of Sam Harris and Bill Maher and the like. And I believe that people have allowed perhaps this one aspect of Reza, which may or may not be useful. In my opinion, personally, there's other people who also give much more eloquent rebuttals of atheism, Islamophobia, whatever that you want to call it. For me, Islamophobia really is just white supremacy, but that's another topic. Like Ali Ata'i, for instance, I think is a brilliant thinker that really gets to and tackles some of the underpinning assumptions of people who are what I would call scientistic, right? Who have taken science beyond the realm and want to proffer it as the only means of knowing or understanding reality. So I think somebody like Ali Ata'i, for instance, and you can look up his videos on YouTube, gives really wonderful and profound rebuttals against that. So one, I mean, Reza isn't the only person, and secondly, he's given that position by the media, which I do find it curious that they would not welcome other Muslim leaders, thinkers, academics, and so on, who are themselves actually, you know, Orthodox committed Muslims. And as many of you are aware of, or perhaps had a hint of, I mean, my statement about Reza and his comment here is not in a vacuum, and it is actually, you know, taking into context other statements that he has made publicly. So this is not backbiting. These are comments that he has made public. Again, you can find these on YouTube, in which he has said many statements that are in contradiction to creedal belief. And some people were upset because they said, oh, you know, you're throwing him outside the bounds of Islam. And I said, well, one, I didn't actually call him kafir. That's a different debate. I just stated that his utterance was a statement of kufr. But I feel today that some Muslims are opposed to the idea that there may actually be a boundary. Now, as somebody that works as imam in the community, naturally I want to actually stretch that boundary to its limit. And I don't think that a person has to necessarily comply with every aspect of ibadah, sharia. Like, you could not pray 5 times a day, you could drink alcohol. I don't recommend it, but that would not remove you from Islam, right? But when you get down to some core fundamental beliefs, there are some things that he says that are worthy debating whether or not we would consider him to be within the belief fold of Islam or not. I'm not going to pass final judgment in this video. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just really clarifying my points and actually hoping that people will examine some of the, I think, perhaps fallacies or even just unnamed assumptions about things that he put. So for instance, he says no hadith, and then in quotes he says is historical. Well, he doesn't give any definition by what he means historical. If we mean historical, that it happened in history or it happened a long time ago, that is somewhat problematic. And he says, then by any modern standard of history. Well, there's an assumption there that modern standards of history, which again he doesn't explain what those are the be-all and end-all of determining what can be or not be of historical reality or not. So that's a major problem that is often the case with the Western academy, or even other areas of Western sciences, which assume their perspective, and I say this as a person born in the West, right? They assume their perspective to be the correct one and beyond the pale of investigation or interrogation. In fact, I'm always curious that so much of Western academia spends its time pointing its gaze around at everything else and does very, very little of pointing its own gaze at itself. And some of the works that have been done have kind of been hushed. So we don't really, you know, this statement doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. But then if we do take it on its sort of literal, like the letters on the page, on its literal value, there are problems with that because it is making a statement. No hadith. And some people, like one person on Twitter chimed up and was making statements about Sahih al-Bukhari. And I tried to tell the person that this goes beyond Bukhari, because there are some Shi'i detractors of the validity of Sahih Bukhari and whatnot. So Reza in this is not differentiating between the Sunni canon, the Shi'i canon. He's just saying the whole business of hadith None of them can be considered historical by any means, or by any standard means. And obviously that statement is modern historical means of determining what is historical are what matter. And therefore, if hadith have been verified by a non-modern standard, then everything in the past is essentially subject and is considered skeptical or unreliable at best. So he continues saying, they were all created to justify orthodox behavior at the time. Now, what surprises me is that from what I've observed about Reza Aslan, he seems to pride himself on being something of a rationalist. And what is interesting is that most rationalists tend to be very hostile towards conspiracy theories. And what Reza is offering up in the second part of his statement here is a conspiracy theory. All of the hadith, right? Now, how many hadith are there? Hundreds of thousands of hadith. And they were compiled by thousands of men, right? So what you have is then a grand conspiracy that was initiated some long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and then was successively perpetrated in a sort of Illuminati fashion, or some sort of like Freemasonry, or that was passed down from generation to generation, in which the lie had to be kept. It's actually sort of very Platonic in a way, right? The sort of, you know, this lie that's done for the truth or something. And I'm just kind of surprised that he would, you know, people say, why are you surprised? I am. I mean, personally, I'm like, wow, anybody that considers themselves to be a person of scholarship, one, you should do some of your own homework. Now, what's interesting, you have people like Patricia Crone and many other Orientalist and Western academic scholars who many years ago kind of said the same thing about hadith, that they were all made up and they were all unreliable and so on and so forth. And yet many of these people abandoned that whole tract after the methodology of how hadith were collected and so on were given a new take. So actually those people withdrew many of their statements on that. So it's curious, I don't, you know, did Reza do his homework, and did he examine the breadth of what other scholarship had taken, or did he just sort of do his own individual shake and bake on this and just make this arbitrary statement? So I really have a number of issues beyond, I do believe it is a statement of kufr, but beyond that, I think it sadly reveals just how much Reza and other academics like him are so completely beholden to Western Orientalist academics that they wound up becoming conspiratorial, and really in many ways their scholarship becomes laughable. And I was just imagining, trying to conjure up, if I was going to use this as a rubric and to apply it to any hadith, right? So imagine this hadith in the Muwatta that's narrated, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتِمِّمَ حُسْنَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. So the Prophet ﷺ says, as recorded in the Muwatta, in this riwayah, in this narration, that he said, peace and blessings be upon him, I wasn't sent except to perfect good character. Now, if they were all created, to justify orthodox behavior, which is in itself a very slanted kind of attack. But if the Prophet ﷺ is saying, or let's say the people that fabricated, or the people who created, right, let's just stick, the people who created this hadith to establish orthodoxy, I'm kind of curious, like, what's so wrong there? I think what's really being getting at is that if we can eliminate the veracity of hadith, then we can essentially eliminate a lot of the religion itself, and therefore Islam can just become this kind of cultural never land, of which we can just make things up, and nothing's real, everything's allegorical, there's no measure of responsibility in this life, because the next one, we don't even really know if it truthfully exists. The other interesting thing, which of course he has made these statements about the story of Jesus, or Isa alayhi salam, in which the Quran is emphatic, that says, and no, indeed they did not crucify Jesus, right, the son of Mary, even though they thought that they did. So what's interesting is that the Quran recognizes this debate about whether or not Jesus was crucified as a historical truth, right? And the Quran emphatically says, no, he was not crucified. And yet, again, you can go on YouTube and you can see Reza Aslan, and of course in his book, saying that the Quran gets the story of Jesus wrong and definitely was crucified. So beyond the qualm of saying that essentially Allah is wrong, or whoever wrote the Quran is wrong, and they got this wrong, that also qualifying as a state of kufr, and maybe leading to the big K word, but that's another discussion. It would seem at some level, though, that Reza does at least accept some aspect of the Quran. And what's really interesting about these sort of Quranist people is that on one hand they may accept the Quran on some level, right? Even though, as Allah talks about in Surah Al-Baqarah, you know, are you the kind of people, right, who believe in part of the book and reject part of it? Even though he appears to believe in some part of the book, well then my question would be, how are you believing in any part of it? Because the same system, the same people who are the transmitters of the Quran are the transmitters of Hadith. And therefore, if you are going to accept some part of it. Now, if you want to come and say, there's no historical basis, by even if you want to say by modern standards, for some hadith, well, that might have been a more tolerable argument, even though still I don't understand why modern, why we're going to impose modern methodologies on something that happened in the past. I don't see the value of that. But if it had been re-articulated as that, I think, well, one, I probably wouldn't have made my statement. And it would have been, I think, less of an issue. But I think it really just goes to show, which is why my overarching thing is, any seriously committed Muslim or semi-seriously committed Muslim should not take what Reza Aslan says in terms of his scholarship about anything about Islam, particularly as it relates as a source of guidance or what is right or wrong or true or false or anything in between, because he is on the path of dalala wa kullu dalalatin fin nar, as the hadith says, the Prophet ﷺ saying, and every misguidance, right, every error in faith, right, leads to the fire. And therefore, as Imam, I think this is where some people don't understand, like, man, why did you have to go and say something? Why couldn't you? Well, when you're put in this position, and I have definitely been put in this position, you have a measure of responsibility. And that doesn't mean that you always get to just tell people what they want to hear or say things that will make them smile. I've never met Reza Aslan. I don't have any like real personal vendetta against him. That's why I'm not insulting him, and I'm just taking him on the merits of his words, right? So I'm not saying like, oh, this guy is this, or he's this kind of horrible person, or name calling. And I've seen people doing that, and then that's very unfortunate. They should not do that. I think we should just stick to the veracity of his public statements or his scholarship or whatnot, and take them from there, without having to, And let's get down to it too. I think Muslims themselves don't understand very well the K word, right? The kafir word. If a person is kafir, it just means they're outside the bounds of Islam. That might not work out very good on the Day of Judgment, right? But that doesn't mean a person is totally devalued of their humanity, or they have zero worth, right? But, there is a boundary, right? Again, we try to extend it, but sometimes things literally do go beyond the bounds. And you can try to hide behind such things, orthodoxy and authority and this or that. Ultimately, there is something that is Islam and something that isn't. And that statement is something that isn't. Whether he is or not, again, I'm not going to tackle that in this video, but we should not shy away. I mean, if anybody looks at my track record, I have no track record publicly or privately of making takfir on people, right? I'm not in the habit of like, oh, this person is a kafir, mu'min, kafir. This is not what I do. But given his unique set of circumstances, his influence, I felt the need to speak out, and alhamdulillah, I was actually, I was given some measure of reassurance when I had, again, a number of people in the community, different scholars and imams, that actually, took a moment to call or text me and actually express their agreement and their support on it. And inshallah, this is just to kind of clarify my position on that. Wa jazakum Allahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.